Hi, it's Katrina. Royal Air Force bomber wreckage. Jim Miles is a former Army pilot who has a fascination with sunken planes and shipwrecks. In fact, Jim spends his spare time these days searching for wrecked vessels from World War II. Back in 2009, he was the one to discover a World War II bomber submerged in the dark waters off the coast of Kimberley, Australia, a place where the riptides are strong enough to pull a person to their death, and where crocodiles lurk unseen beneath the surface. Just recently, Jim returned to the site with better technology to actually document the wreckage for the world to see. Sure enough, the plane hadn't moved. The B-24 bomber was still sitting in the murky depths with its tires intact, looking like it had just made an emergency landing. This airplane went down on March 23, 1945. 12 airmen were on board the bomber when it crashed near the Truscott airfield. During the war, this was a top-secret base for the Royal Australian Air Force. This is where a lot of covert missions started. The B-24 Liberator took off for a bombing run to attack the Japanese in Indonesia, but it barely made it off the runway before it hit the water. Only 3 bodies were ever recovered from the wreckage. Secret Nazi bunker. A group of historians have recently discovered a lost German bunker in the middle of a Latvian field 70 years after it was abandoned. These historians journeyed to Saldus in Latvia in search of old war relics. This place was one of the final strongholds of Nazi Germany after Adolf Hitler died in 1945. When the Red Army was pushing forward on the Eastern Front, German soldiers were held up here in bunkers and trenches. Many of these soldiers were caught off guard by the invading Russians and were forced to leave their military fortifications and run for cover. A lot of those fortifications were in perfect condition when the Russians rolled in, and most of them were just kind of dismissed and then lost as the fighting moved farther west. In the following years, these abandoned fortifications became gold mines for people known as black diggers. They combed through old military sites and pillaged what they could find to sell illegally. But these 4 historians hit the jackpot in November of 2019 when they found one of the bunkers totally untouched. Not a single person had entered this place in 7 decades. They had to use heavy machinery to dig it out of the ground. And that was when they found the entrance, leading them down into the bunker still filled with German military equipment, guns, ammunition, a wood stove, a desk covered in papers, a completely pristine Nazi bunker trapped in time. All the discoveries were handed over to the Latvian War Museum in Riga. German war machine. A recent drought has caused a lost German military vehicle to surface from the River Po in northern Italy. It's believed the vehicle was pushed into the river as the German troops were retreating in April of 1945. This was a common practice of the Germans to prevent their equipment from falling into the hands of enemy soldiers. Historical records show that a British reconnaissance plane spotted the vehicle, but when soldiers tried to find it, the thing was gone. Now, it's finally been discovered by Samuele Bernini, a volunteer at the Second World War Museum in Sermide. He spotted it sticking out of the sand at the bottom of the dried-up riverbed. It's a military truck on tracks that weighs roughly 7 tons. It was used widely in World War II, mostly for transporting guns, like the Flak 42 anti-aircraft gun and the 10.5-centimeter light-field howitzer. It also had enough space to carry 8 soldiers and enough power to plow through almost 2 feet of water. But the truck wasn't the only thing located thanks to this drought. The wreckage of a large boat was also found at the bottom of the river, sunk 70 years ago by Nazi bombs. Grenades at McDonald's. Army bomb disposal experts were called to a McDonald's restaurant in England in April of 2022 because somebody was messing around with hand grenades from World War II. It happened at about 5 o'clock in the afternoon, right at rush hour. The grenade had come from a house which had been cleared of all its junk earlier that day, with the junk having been shoved into a van. It was only later, after the van had been driven to the McDonald's, that the people who cleared out the house realized they had actual military explosives sitting in a bucket. The cops were called, the bomb disposal was sent, and the place had to be cordoned off while they did an investigation. It turned out the grenades weren't dangerous, but it was still quite the affair with the number of cops and bomb vans that showed up and blocked the street. We don't know where exactly the grenades came from, but seeing as it was an old house and all the stuff inside had to be cleared out, it's safe to assume that somebody had been holding on to these things for a very long time. They had probably forgotten all about them, only for the grenades to be discovered all these years later by some shocked workers who only wanted to finish their shift and get a cheeseburger. It's shout-out time! I wanted to say a big thank you to Gary Just Johnson and Maddie Gaga 2013 for supporting this channel. Be sure to subscribe if you haven't already for more videos about amazing discoveries from wartime. The sunken Nazi treasure ship. Divers recently uncovered the wreckage of a warship from World War II, and they believe the wreckage of this German vessel could help them solve the mystery of the legendary Amber Room. The Amber Room was part of the Great Catherine Palace near St. Petersburg. It was the pride of Russia, a room decorated with pounds of amber and gold. It was extremely valuable, but when the Germans invaded Russia, it was dismantled piece by piece, and eventually it disappeared. The last time the contents of the room were seen, they were in Königsberg, a port city controlled by the Germans. Nobody knows exactly where the room went after that. Some believe it went on a train and ended up being deposited in some secret mountain base, where it's still hiding to this very day. Others believe it got on the Karlsruhe, a steamer that set sail from Königsberg in 1945 with a very heavy cargo and 1,083 people on board. However, before it could even leave the coast of Poland, it was sunk by Soviet warplanes. Finally, divers have discovered the whereabouts of the Karlsruhe sitting at the bottom of the Baltic Sea. It's almost perfectly intact, but it's not too easy to investigate. It's a huge vessel with closed steel doors that divers can't exactly pry open with heavy tools. They believe the disassembled Amber Room could be hiding somewhere inside this busted vessel. It's just that they can't actually breach the ship's hold yet to see if they are right. Bomb in London. Residents in southeast London were told to evacuate their homes after construction workers uncovered an unexploded bomb from World War II. The bomb was positively huge, weighing over 1,000 pounds. This was the kind of bomb that would be dropped on London to tear down an entire building and leave a crater in the street. The thing was about 5 feet tall, complete with a tail fin, and was so potentially dangerous it could have blown apart all the houses within 600 feet of the site. Thankfully, that didn't happen. The Royal Logistic Corps bomb disposal team, after everyone had been cleared from the area, risked their own lives to defuse the leftover piece of war ordnance. It ended up being a big success. The bomb was safely defused, and nobody blew up, and everyone was allowed to return back home. In case you didn't know, this is actually a huge problem in England. During World War II, Germany tried to bomb the English into submission by dropping thousands upon thousands of tons of explosives on the capital. Some of those bombs didn't blow up. According to the London Fire Brigade, between 2009 and 2014 alone, they had to attend to 7 unexploded bombs that had been accidentally discovered, along with 5 unexploded hand grenades. Bing Crosby's War Letters. Bing Crosby was one of the biggest stars of the 1950s, alongside the likes of Frank Sinatra and Cole Porter. And while Bing Crosby is mostly famous for his musical career, specifically for the best-selling single that has ever been released, White Christmas, he also played a small part in World War II. Crosby's daughter Mary revealed in 2019 how her mother had found a collection of letters while organizing the attic of her home. Crosby was involved in the Armed Forces radio service, broadcasting constantly to U.S. military personnel overseas. He broadcasted at least 70 different times during the war and made plenty of other appearances to boost soldier morale. These mysterious letters appear to have been mailed from Bing Crosby to soldiers on the front lines fighting against Adolf Hitler and Nazi Germany. The letters don't go into too much detail and are mostly friendly correspondence between Bing and the soldiers as part of his campaign to keep morale high. The tragic part is that according to Mary Crosby, many of the letters were found stamped "Return to Sender," meaning that many had never even made it to the soldiers who lost their lives. The Guernsey Bunker. There is a terrifying place somewhere you would never expect. It's an old and abandoned Nazi concentration camp in the Channel Islands, a place overgrown and forgotten, but still very much there. The remnants of what was once Camp Silt, a heavily guarded German prison, can still be seen on Alderney, which is part of the British Crown dependency. Basically, it's part of Britain, but not the British Isles. It's a small archipelago in the ocean between England and mainland Europe. After France fell to the Nazis in June of 1940, the British government realized they couldn't defend the territories in the Channel Islands. They had to evacuate the citizens and just let the Germans take it. Hitler was so impressed with himself for being able to capture even just a small piece of something British that he fortified Alderney to an extreme extent. He built a slave labor camp to mock Britain, filled it with French Jewish people, and killed thousands. When the war was over, the camp was abandoned and left in ruins. Nobody really paid much attention to it as the citizens came back, started their lives anew, and just let the old fortifications be grown over naturally. But recently, Caroline Sturdy Calls, an archaeologist who specializes in Holocaust sites, began digging in the dirt here to uncover potential war graves and the true remains of the Nazi fortresses. In March 1943, it became a concentration camp run by the Skull Unit of the SS paramilitaries. And while she hasn't discovered any mass graves yet, she has dug up long-forgotten walls, found lost artifacts, and other evidence of the scale of Hitler's occupation of the islands. Italian submarine wreckage. In the Aegean Sea off the coast of Greece, local divers came across the wreckage of an Italian submarine that sank 80 years ago. It was hit by Allied forces during World War II on July 5, 1941. It was called the Jantina, and it had sailed from the small Greek island of Leros when it found itself under siege by the British submarine HMS Torbay. The Torbay fired torpedoes, the Italian submarine was blown to bits, and 48 sailors went down with it. That's the one thing that really sucks about being hit in a submarine. You don't exactly have anywhere to escape to. It wasn't even an archaeologist who found this fascinating wreckage, but one of the most popular divers in Greece, a guy named Kostas Thoktaridis. He considers himself a maritime expert and something of an amateur archaeologist. He and his team discovered the sunken vessel using a special underwater vehicle called the ROV Super Achilles to go down over 300 feet deep. So far, it's the fourth submarine the professional diver has found in the area, which is basically a mass grave for World War II ships. Roosevelt's car. The longest continuous campaign in World War II was the Battle of the Atlantic. It lasted 6 years while the Allies struggled to gain any kind of control over the Atlantic Ocean. After Nazi Germany dominated pretty much all of Europe overnight, Britain was the only one left standing because of their isolation as an island. For the next 6 years, the waters around Britain were filled with non-stop fighting. Things got even worse in 1941 after the German invasion of Russia, as Allies tried sending much-needed supplies to the Soviets. And so it was that Iceland became one of the most important checkpoints during World War II. It was in a strategically smart position between North America, Europe, and Russia, and so it was here that supplies going from London or Washington to Moscow were traded off. Hitler knew this, and so he directed many of his deadly U-boats to badger the waters off the coast of Reykjavik, trying to disrupt supplies as much as possible. One of the vessels the Germans sank was the SS Godafoss. It was carrying cargo and civilians, and it went down on November 10, 1944. Everyone on board lost their lives, and something else was lost as well. Obviously not as important as people's lives, but it did become quite the mystery. On board that ship was a car meant as a gift to the US President Franklin Roosevelt from Svein Björnsson, the president of Iceland. That car supposedly was one of a kind, an unknown make with a golden wheel. But sadly, the car hasn't actually been found. And although we do know the location of the SS Godafoss, nobody has ever gone down there to take a look. It's called the Titanic of Iceland, and it could be hiding one of the rarest cars in the entire world. Giant buried swastika. The city of Hamburg in Germany recently destroyed a giant concrete swastika that was found buried on a sports field of a residential neighborhood. Imagine playing soccer and finding a swastika. The shameful symbol of Nazi Germany was about 12 feet wide on each side, and it was built 72 years ago as part of a government program. The swastika was originally covered in bricks and used as the foundation for a monument celebrating the strength of German workers. But that monument was torn down in 1945. Following the end of World War II, angry locals in Hamburg smashed apart the monument and left the brick foundation, with the swastika hidden beneath the earth. They covered it up with some dirt, and everyone forgot it was there. Eventually, the spot became a park. It was used as a sports field, and then the field was dug up to reveal the very thing everyone had forgotten was there. Right after the discovery was made, there were calls to preserve the huge concrete swastika for historical purposes, but this was followed by a huge uproar from the locals, who said they didn't need a massive concrete hate symbol to remind them of their past. And so, jackhammers and bulldozers came and destroyed the swastika once and for all. Salish War Club. An ancient Native American artifact was discovered in a backyard in Vancouver Island. Mark Lake was cleaning his yard after a big storm in April of 2022 when he came across a piece of wood sticking out from under a maple tree. Mark lives in the seaside village of Royston, a small hamlet where most people know their neighbor. When he retrieved the piece of wood, he was shocked to see that it had been carved by human hands. It felt important, and so he reached out to the local Camouflage First Nation. Chief Nicole Rempel described the discovery as pretty exciting. Nicole has been working with repatriation of artifacts since 2013 and had never seen a completely intact piece like the one Mark had found. It turned out to be a fully functioning war club. This was a solid piece of wood carved to be a weapon of war, something designed specifically for bashing somebody to death with. Upon learning what he had discovered, Mark willingly handed the artifact over to be preserved by the Camouflage First Nation. And right now, archaeologists are still working to find out more about it. It was definitely a weapon of violence, but it's unclear when it was made or how it ended up in Mark's backyard. For all he knows, his house is on a Native American graveyard or even on an undiscovered village buried beneath his property. Lost Maya Capital. An ancient Maya city was discovered in the backyard of a cattle rancher in Mexico. Experts with Brown University were called in to excavate the site, which was quickly dubbed La Canja del Tal. Researchers believe the city was once a powerful Maya capital, settled around the year 750 BC, and occupied for about 1,000 years. It was the main hub for the governmental powers of the local kingdom of Sakzi, and then it was abandoned and forgotten. Over the following centuries of abandonment, the city was completely overgrown by vegetation, covered by dirt, and made invisible. It was only found when a farmer in the state of Chiapas uncovered a stone tablet in his backyard. The site was found by archaeologists by total luck. Whitaker Schroeder from the University of Pennsylvania was informed by a carnita seller on a highway that a local farmer had found something interesting. Whitaker was already studying archaeological sites in the area, so he agreed to check it out. That was in 2014, and it took 4 years until excavations could get started. Researchers don't believe this city was quite as large as other well-known cities like Palenque, another massive metropolis in Mexico's southern jungle. However, it did contain a giant pyramid, palaces occupied by the city's elite, and majestic religious sites. There is a grand plaza and great fortifications to keep out enemies. This was definitely a major capital, likely ruled over by a powerful king. But seeing as exploration has only just gotten underway, there is still a lot to be discovered about the lost city of La Canja del Tal. World War II Wreckage. A Danish teenager and his father found the remains of a plane from World War II in their backyard. A 14-year-old doing a homework assignment came across the remains of a German Messerschmitt plane, along with the skeletal corpse of its pilot, just behind his house. The boy's name is Daniel Rom Christensen. His father, Klaus, had been told by his late grandfather that a plane crashed on their property during the war. However, Klaus's great-grandfather was notorious for making up stories that weren't entirely true, so the family never really believed him. But then, when Daniel said he had to do some history homework on the subject of World War II, Klaus suggested they excavate the backyard to see if the remains of the aircraft were really there. Much to their surprise, they found the wreckage. First, they found some scraps of metal, and this was a pretty big shock. They decided to dig even deeper and borrowed an excavator from the neighbor. The father and son duo dug about 20 feet deep in the backyard and uncovered thousands of scraps from the World War II aircraft. They also found the pilot's bones and personal objects hidden in the dirt. Forensic police are currently trying to figure out who the pilot was. as well as the situation around the crash. The rest of the artifacts have been taken to the local museum to be preserved. What would you do if you found a crashed World War II plane in your backyard? Let me know in the comments below. Dinosaur Rib Cage. A property owner in Portugal recently embarked on some home renovations, and it didn't take long before he made a shocking discovery in his backyard. He found a full set of dinosaur ribs. Just underneath the surface of his yard was a dinosaur rib cage, something experts are saying could be the largest single set of dinosaur remains in all of Europe. This was one of the biggest discoveries for paleontologists in 2022. After the property owner uncovered the bones, a team of Spanish and Portuguese experts descended on the man's property to excavate. Experts believe it's a fossilized brachiosaurid sauropod. It belonged to the family of the largest dinosaurs that ever lived. Sauropods were the biggest animals that ever walked our planet. They had long necks, long tails, and some could grow up to 122 feet long. The dinosaur buried in the man's backyard was likely about 39 feet tall and 82 feet from the tip of its nose to the end of its tail. Its rib cage is big enough that you can have a party inside of it. You could literally drape a tarp over the ribs and turn the fossil into a small house. Arizona bomb shelter. A man in Tucson discovered a bomb shelter hiding in his backyard from the Cold War. The homeowner is John Sims, and he bought the new home in Midtown from a friend earlier in the year. His friend told him after he purchased the property that there could be a bomb shelter in the backyard, but he wasn't entirely sure. In response, John said, "Give me a shovel and I'll dig it up right now." But John couldn't find anything. He dug several shallow holes in the backyard in the brutal summer heat and gave up. It looked like the bomb shelter was nothing but a rumor. But then he got a new idea. He hired a consultant who brought a metal detector and scanned the yard for any buried metal. And that was when they finally found the entrance to the bomb shelter buried 3 feet deep. John pried open the heavy metal hatch and descended into a small shelter filled with decades of rubble. Much to his disappointment, there were no artifacts to be found. There were no radiation detectors, no civil defense boxes, and no leftover war relics. All he found were some water jugs. But he did discover the history of the shelter. It was likely built by Whittaker Pools, who built many of these bomb shelters throughout Tucson in the 1960s at the height of nuclear fear. Homeowners were terrified that Russia would bomb America, and anyone with the money to spare was eager to get their own personal fallout shelter. Mysterious Roman slab. A homeowner in the small English village of White Parish discovered an ancient marble slab in the garden behind her bungalow. It was from the days when Rome ruled over the island of Great Britain. The mysterious slab contains Greek inscriptions that have dated it back to the 2nd century AD. But how exactly it got in the garden in the first place is still a mystery. The homeowner actually discovered the stone in the garden behind her house 20 years ago. She then used the stone in her stable as a horse mounting block. She stepped on this thing to get onto the back of her horse for about a decade before she finally noticed the mysterious Greek letters on the block. But just how did it arrive in her garden in the first place? According to antique specialist Will Hobbs, wealthy aristocrats often brought classical art, random artifacts, and other pieces of foreign culture back to England when they toured Europe in the 18th century. Someone with a lot of money likely picked the slab up from a market somewhere in Greece, then ditched it in the backyard outside their house. As for that Greek inscription, it reads, "The people and the young men honor Demetrius, son of Metrodorus, the son of Lucius." It's not exactly clear what that means though, but at least we have the family's names. Ancient mystery sword. 4,000 years ago in the Bronze Age, somebody lost their sword. It got covered over in dirt, slowly decayed and broke into fragments, and nobody saw it again until recently, when a man in Finland found it in his parents' back garden. The sword dates back to 1700 BC and was pulled piece by piece out of the backyard by a man with a metal detector. His name is Matti Rintama, and he purchased the metal detector 2 weeks before he made this shocking discovery. One of the first places he went was his parents' large property in the village of Penella. He wasn't expecting much, but it seemed like a good place to start hunting for treasure. Sure enough, he found about half a dozen sword fragments and showed them to a more experienced friend. This friend told him he was dealing with a sword, and that was when Finland's National Board of Antiquities was called in. Archaeologists descended on the backyard like hungry scavengers. They soon uncovered the rest of the sword. The artifact is now one of only 25 similar weapons found from the Finnish Bronze Age. As for how the weapon got into the backyard, archaeologist Lina Koivisto says it was probably thrown into a shallow body of water. It may have been a marsh or a swamp, and someone either ditched the sword on purpose or lost it in their travels. The sword was then covered in layers of peat and eventually became part of a backyard. Mammoth Bones. A paleontologist discovered a graveyard of mammoth bones in his own backyard. In an unbelievably coincidental discovery, he may have just found the oldest evidence of human beings in North America outside his own home. Paleontologist Timothy Rao first learned he had fossils in his backyard in 2013. One of his neighbors saw something sticking out from a hillside on his property in New Mexico. When Timothy went to investigate, he found a crushed mammoth skull and a tusk, along with other mammoth bones that were clearly broken on purpose. After more investigating and a few more years, Timothy and his colleagues had unveiled a mammoth butchering site dating back 37,000 years. This is huge for a lot of reasons, but mainly for the age of the site. Up until recently, most scientists agree that humans arrived in North America no earlier than 16,000 years ago. But the mammoth bones here show obvious signs of human intervention. The bones revealed evidence of being burned, pulverized, and worked over by human hands. This had been a place where early men and women gathered to process mammoth remains. Mammoths they likely helped hunt off the face of the earth, and they were doing it over 20,000 years before humans were supposed to have even been in North America. This is now one of the biggest archaeological finds in North American history. It's changing the history books as we know them, and it's all thanks to a nosy neighbor noticing a bone in Timothy's backyard. Ice Age horse. In 2018, landscapers in Lehi, Utah, found the skeletal remains of a wild horse buried in a client's backyard. At first, researchers thought they were dealing with an ancient wild horse, one that roamed across the American Southwest in the days before highways and skyscrapers. It was originally dated at 16,000 years old, before the end of the last ice age. However, scientists soon realized that was wrong, and that the horse was likely buried about 11,700 years ago. But that turned out to be wrong as well. The hoofed beast has only been in the ground for 340 years, meaning it was a domestic horse that lived far more recently. It's understandable how these scientists got their information wrong. After all, North America was home to wild horses from between 50 million and 10,000 years ago. Wild horses only vanished across North America around the same time that the mammoths, dire wolves, short-faced bears, and giant sloths went extinct. It was a combination of climate change and early human hunters that led to the demise of all these animals. But this horse didn't come from prehistoric days. It died following the Spanish introduction of domestic horses in the 16th century. Archaeologists analyzed the bones and learned that the horse was about 12 years old at the time of death. The lead author of the study, William Taylor from the University of Colorado Boulder, says the horse was likely cared for by an indigenous person who lived in Utah. Researchers were even able to tell how frequently the horse had been ridden. The fractures were caused by somebody jostling on the horse's lower back. The horse also had arthritis and belonged to the species Equus caballus, a kind of modern domestic horse. And finally, researchers could tell that even though the horse suffered several injuries, it was cared for up until the time of death. Airman in the ice. In Kings Canyon National Park, a corpse was discovered entombed in a glacier. The body was likely an airman from World War II who died in a plane crash in 1942. The discovery came in 2005 when a pair of climbers reported a frozen head sticking out of the ice. They were climbing Mount Mendel in the Sierra Nevada and were way up near the 13,710-foot peak when they found a frozen human head, along with a shoulder and an arm reaching out from the glacier. According to park spokesperson Alexandra Picavet, the body was at least 80% frozen in ice and was still equipped with an Army-issued parachute. His sweater was also visible and was torn to reveal frozen skin. He also still had his sandy blonde hair intact, although it was mostly crusted with ice and snow. Park officials believe the airman was most likely a member of the AT-7 navigational training plane crew that crashed on the mountain on November 18, 1942. It was one of many military airplanes that crashed during World War II training. The wreckage of that particular plane was discovered by a climber in 1947, along with 4 bodies, but apparently they missed this one. This individual appears to have been ejected way out into the wilderness, frozen at a spot on the mountain that takes days to reach by foot. It's no wonder nobody ever found the body before. Unfortunately, we still don't have an ID. The news story broke in 2005, and there has not been a single major update since, suggesting the trail for the unknown soldier has gone cold. Let us know if you have any information. Murdered nuns. Catholic nuns were brutally murdered at the hands of Soviet soldiers in the closing days of World War II. Archaeologists recently unearthed the skeletons of these nuns after months of searching for their bones. The gruesome story takes us back to the Red Army's invasion of Poland in 1944. As Nazi Germany withdrew their own soldiers, Soviet forces began a battle of their own. They suppressed the Polish militia, imprisoned and deported Polish soldiers, killed civilians and clergy, and slaughtered 7 nuns in the Order of St. Catherine of Alexandria. The Soviets present themselves these days as liberators of Poland, but the reality is that they entered the nation with just as much cruelty and brutality as the Nazis. History doesn't lie, and we know that Russia tried to seize control of Poland in the chaos caused by Germany's retreat. According to the Warsaw Institute, the days following the Soviet invasion were days of mass terror. Archaeologists were eager to find out where the murdered nuns had been buried so they could properly put them to rest. They excavated a site in Gdansk in July of 2020 and found the remains of Sister Chartina. Additional excavations in Olsztyn revealed the remains of 3 more sisters who had been nurses at St. Mary's Hospital. However, there were 3 nuns left to be found. In December of that same year, archaeologists excavated a municipal cemetery in Orneta. There they exhumed remains after remains until they finally found the last 3 victims of Soviet murder. Abandoned bunkers. Researchers recently uncovered creepy and terrifying secret Nazi bunkers. These bunkers were found in Normandy, and they were utilized over 70 years ago against American soldiers as they stormed the beaches on D-Day. Josh Gates, the executive producer and host of Expedition Unknown, was one of the first to enter these time capsules. He and his team dug through the dirt, found the doors, broke in, and then rooted around inside of the decaying structures for artifacts. The team investigated 2 large bunkers, each one with 3 or 4 large rooms. The rooms are connected by staircases and hallways, and they are all part of a much larger system known as the Maisie Battery. Positioned about 2 miles inland from Omaha Beach, the Maisie Battery was like a wall of death for the Allied soldiers. The battery boasted 14 massive guns, including multiple 150mm howitzers. It was one of the toughest fortifications on mainland Europe and played a crucial role in what happened on D-Day. One of the worst parts for the Allies was that the Germans had built the battery in complete secrecy. Nobody had realized they were about to be bombarded by such a powerful military installation. During the investigation of the bunkers, researchers found evidence of a great burning. The ceilings had been scorched, suggesting those inside had been burned out during the fighting. It must have been extremely somber to be standing in a room where German soldiers may have been cooked alive. The bog body. There's a gruesomely mummified Soviet pilot who was allegedly discovered in a bog. The pilot, believed to be Boris Alexandrovich Lazarev, was found in 1998 in a swamp somewhere in Europe. His plane was part of a group that had set off from a Soviet military base to attack the Germans. Boris was shot down during the mission, and both he and his plane crashed into the wet, stinking swamp below. And there Boris remained, preserved almost perfectly due to a bizarre mixture of anaerobic conditions in the moist soil. Unfortunately, not all of Boris was preserved. The force of the crash somehow severed his feet at the ankles. He was discovered curled up in the fetal position in the swamp, preserved like a mummy, with his feet nowhere to be found. Missing airmen. At the very bottom of the Adriatic Sea is a bomber plane from World War II. The plane is decaying and fragmented, little more than a creepy pile of rust and propellers. It's known as the Tulsa American, and it has been sitting at the bottom of the sea since 1944. In 2017, a team of archaeologists wrapped up a recovery mission at the site of this ghoulish shipwreck. They found a small trove of artifacts, along with the possible remains of 3 soldiers who died when the plane crashed. The initial discovery of the Tulsa American came in 2010 off the coast of the Croatian island of Vis. The B-24 Liberator bomber, built in Tulsa, Oklahoma, was snapped in half on the sea floor, and the nose of the plane had been peeled open like a banana. The plane wound up in the sea because in December of 1944, the Tulsa American was involved in a dogfight with German air forces over occupied Poland. The bomber fought well, but the German force overwhelmed it. The crew tried to make an emergency landing but accidentally crashed instead. 7 crew members were saved by local fishermen, and 3 went down with the plane. Archaeologists working at the scene of the crash found military equipment, a life vest, a flight boot, and other articles of clothing. Mate Barica from Zadar University in Croatia says the remains of human bones were also found, but they had yet to be tested or confirmed as those of the missing airmen. It's shout-out time! Want to say a big thank you to Anthony, Rich, and Nels. Thanks so much for watching and supporting this channel. If you are new here, be sure to hit that subscribe button and join the Origins Explained family. Secret Nazi Island. Schatzgraber is German for treasure hunter, but is also the name of an old weather station built by the German military in 1943 in the middle of nowhere, just miles from the North Pole. It was constructed on the large island of Alexanderland, located within the Franz Josef Land archipelago. It's located over 680 miles from the already isolated Russian city of Arkhangelsk. Schatzgraber is covered in snow for most of the year. Everything is frozen in ice, and the last time anyone visited the place was in the 1980s. It wasn't until 2016 that an archaeological team made the long journey to the secret Nazi island as part of an investigation. According to Evgeny Ermolov from the Russian Arctic National Park, the Arctic was so warm in 2016 that the island was free of snow for one of the first times in history. The team was able to explore the old weather station without any problems. They found German army and naval uniforms, abandoned weapons, pieces of ammunition, landmines, and all kinds of other artifacts from World War II. All this stuff was left behind when a German U-boat came to evacuate the last surviving occupants in 1944. Prior to the evacuation, a group of German scientists were stationed at the island as part of a secret network of Arctic bases. They were supposed to be giving advanced weather warnings to the Germans in Northern Europe as part of their war strategy. The Germans believed that if they could predict the weather better than anyone else, they would have a huge advantage when it came to planning battles and operations. Hidden battlefields. Hidden within the mossy forests of northwestern Europe are the ghosts of brutal dogfights from World War II. These forests may not look like it, but they are covered in the scars of war. Bomb craters that look like natural sinkholes in the earth, trenches that you can still fall in and break your ankle, and more ammunition than you can carry hidden underneath fresh layers of dirt and grass. David Passmore from the University of Toronto recently led a study looking into the remnants of battlegrounds in European forests. David is a specialist in conflict archaeology and knows all about battlefields throughout human history. David was interested in studying the forests because, according to him, there have already been plenty of studies done on coastal fortifications and big battlefields, but not so much the small battles in the woods. David and his team focused on northwestern France, the Ardennes forests in Belgium, as well as the Reichswald and Hurtgenwald forests in western Germany. What they found were foxholes, trenches, German logistics depots, and the half-hidden support networks that had once snaked through the trees. However, they didn't find any one artifact or abandoned structure that was particularly terrifying. Instead, It was the forests themselves, now so quiet and subdued, filled with the lingering air of war. Mass Nazi grave. In 2020, archaeologists found a mass grave full of Nazi soldiers from the Second World War in Poland. The skeletal remains of 18 Nazi paratroopers were exhumed from the ground, along with a small number of artifacts such as weapons, war medals, and tools. These haunting graves were found in the Polish village of Kozlice, and while the skeletons were beyond any kind of identification since they had long been stripped of their flesh, they did still have dog tags. These tags connected the skeletons to the Luftwaffe, the terrifying German Air Force responsible for bombing London back into the Dark Ages and terrorizing Europe. The mass grave was discovered behind some rural buildings. According to the local Historical and Archaeological Research Laboratory, the area is known for its hidden graves. Many skeletons have been found here, but they aren't usually German. Nobody is sure what happened to the paratroopers. We don't know if they were killed by the Polish militia, if it was the Russians who slaughtered them, or if it was angry local villagers. All we know is that they were butchered and dumped into a pit, along with their trench knives, helmets, and water flasks. Creepy beach treasure. In 2022, one lucky family's Texas vacation turned into a bizarre history lesson. Amanda Ward and her relatives were wandering along Port Aransas Beach on a Saturday when they came across a mysterious object. It definitely wasn't a rock, and it appeared to have skin on it. Amanda and her family got as close as they dared, and soon realized the creepy object had a rancid odor. When they decided it wasn't going to explode, they began poking and prodding at it. They ripped off layers of its stretchy tan-colored flesh and whacked off some barnacles and clams that were growing on it. But they still couldn't figure out what the mystery box was. There was a bit of speculation at first, and they thought maybe it was a box of treasure or jewels. They eventually found a bystander with a knife and cut straight through the thing. However, all they found was layer after layer of rubbery material. After they posted their strange discovery online, they got some answers. The Padre Island National Seashore informed the family that they had stumbled upon a German rubber bale from World War II. It likely came from a sunken German warship, possibly the SS Rio Grande. The Rio Grande was a blockade runner that sank in 1944 while carrying tin, cobalt, and crude rubber bales. The USS Omaha spotted the German ship off the coast of Brazil and sank it. Ever since, stinking bales of crude rubber have been occasionally washing up on beaches. Death submarine. The rusted remains of a Nazi submarine was discovered in 2013 off the coast of Java, Indonesia. To make the find even grislier, the wreckage contained rotting human bones. The submarine, or German U-boat as it's more commonly known, still had the 17 skeletons of its crew members stuck inside of its busted hull. Experts called it an unprecedented discovery, and a rare example of how brutal the battles were in the Southwest Pacific during World War II. Bambang Budi Utomo from the National Archaeology Center in Indonesia said this was the first time a foreign submarine from World War II was found in their waters. The wreck appears to be that of the U-168. This menacing submarine was used successfully by German naval forces to sink multiple Allied ships. It was a terror during the war, but met its match at the hands of a Dutch submarine. The U-boat was on its way to Australia when the Dutch spotted it, sent torpedoes screaming through the water at its hull, and blasted the submarine to the bottom of the ocean. The Dutch sub fired 6 torpedoes, but only one of them detonated. Still, it was enough to destroy the German war machine. 23 German sailors lost their lives, while the captain and 26 crew members managed to make it to the surface and survive. Bringing a dog back to life. What was intended to be a medical miracle ended as a horrific experiment. In 1940, Soviet scientists reanimated a dead dog. Dr. Sergei Brukhonenko was a pioneer in the science of blood transfusion. He was one of the leading scientists who learned how to take blood from one person and put it into somebody else's body. This is something that still remains essential in medical operations to this day. But the physician's science took a dark and grisly turn. He began doing things like isolating individual organs and keeping them working. He created mechanism for lungs to breathe on their own and for hearts to continue pumping blood. And then he stepped things up a notch and tried to reanimate the severed head of a dog. Dr. Brukhonenko did this by pumping oxygenated blood through the arteries. The head received a blood supply to the brain, which worked to make its ears and eyes move, and it even licked its own nose. Similar experiments were carried out by the Soviets. They brought dogs back to life using oxygenated blood, but none of the dogs were technically alive. Their bodies were merely being kept functional by the machines. It's like a chicken with its head cut off, still flailing even after death. This science was revolutionary for the time. In World War II, these experiments seemed to suggest a zombie army to fight the Soviets' battle was entirely possible. Operation Camouflage. Operation Camouflage was one of the biggest deception projects of the war, and most people don't even know about it. When Pearl Harbor was attacked, things changed immediately for Lockheed Martin. They had about 53,000 employees at the time spread across communities in Southern California. They were the ones who created the P-38 fighters and Hudson bombers used by the American military. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, Lockheed Martin needed to step up production. At the same time, the military was desperately trying to figure out how to disguise Lockheed's plant so that it wouldn't become the target of sabotage or a direct attack by the Japanese. The project involved set designers, local artists, painters from movie studios, and experts from Disney, Paramount, and 20th Century Fox. These experts put together a grand illusion at the Lockheed plant. Airfields and parking lots were disguised as fields of alfalfa. The factory was covered in chicken wire, netting, and canvas to make it look like grass. Fake trees were also put up all over the site, and a whole underground system of walkways was implemented so that employees didn't have to go above ground. In a very short span of time, the Lockheed Martin facility looked like nothing but a chunk of farmland from above. The Manhattan Project. The Manhattan Project was arguably the greatest secret operation of World War II, mainly because it brought the war with Japan to a decisive end. The project went on far from the public eye. Scientist Robert Oppenheimer and his team, inspired by the work of Albert Einstein and Leo Szilard, worked in secret to create the first atomic bomb in the world. But the project was a lot more complicated than people these days give it credit for. It wasn't just a bunch of scientists in an underground lab making bombs. The project cost over $2 billion and required roughly 125,000 workers across America to pull it off. Most of the people had no idea they were working on a weapon of mass destruction. There were teams of physicists hired to create the detonation system. Then there were the secret plants in Tennessee and Washington, where uranium and plutonium elements were prepared for atomic detonation. All this hard work led to the infamous Trinity test in the New Mexico desert in July of 1945. It was a major success, and America then used their atomic bomb to blow apart Nagasaki and Hiroshima. This officially ended the war with Japan. It's shoutout time! I wanted to say a big thank you to Ashley House and Brucey for supporting this channel. Be sure to subscribe for more videos like these. Operation Pastorius. Operation Pastorius was cooked up by German intelligence as a way to sabotage the United States during the war, but the operation did not exactly go according to plan. This was one of the first efforts made by Nazi Germany to sabotage the American war effort. It happened just 4 days after the United States officially declared war on Germany. Hitler authorized a special mission to sabotage factories and demoralize Americans. Admiral Wilhelm Canaris was put in charge of the operation. He was the one who sabotaged the French installations in Morocco during World War I. His mission was to attack arms factories on U.S. soil, crippling America's ability to produce weapons and equipment. The only real dent made by the mission came on July 30th, 1916. The munition supply depot at Black Tom Island was sabotaged by agents of Germany. Explosions went off at the facility in the New York harbor. 4 people were killed, and an estimated $20 million worth of munitions were obliterated. But the mission was already falling apart. One of the agents had gotten drunk at a tavern and told everyone he was a secret agent. Then the mission commander, George Dask, accidentally left confidential documents on a train. George didn't even want to be a secret agent. He wound up calling the FBI, explaining who he was, and then the FBI called him a liar and basically hung up on him. He had to travel all the way to Washington, D.C. and walk into the FBI headquarters to give himself up, and they still barely believed him. He did eventually prove himself to be a secret agent, and over the next few weeks, the rest of his team was arrested. The FBI director of the day, J. Edgar Hoover, buried George's part of the story and took all the credit for himself. Japanese chemical warfare. One of the most ghoulish operations of World War II involved a secret division of mad scientists known as Unit 731. This was a branch of the Imperial Japanese Army responsible for some of the most brutal experiments done on humans ever. The Nazis definitely practiced some horrifying experiments on their prisoners, but Unit 731 was in a league all its own. They preferred experimenting on Chinese civilians, which they captured throughout the 1930s and 40s. Their experiments helped the Japanese develop devastating chemical and biological weapons. It wasn't even until the late 1990s that Japan grudgingly acknowledged the unit once existed, but ever since, they have refused to discuss the activities in detail. Instead, former members of the unit were the ones who had to come forward to reveal the atrocities, as well as unsealed documents and disturbing photographs. From these testimonies, we know Unit 731 conducted lethal experiments on roughly 3,000 unwilling Chinese and Korean prisoners. Some people would be deliberately infected with horrifying diseases like typhus and cholera. Some victims were dissected while still alive, and others suffered even more gruesome ends that I don't dare repeat here. But perhaps the most shocking part is that at the end of the war, the United States allegedly granted the unit official immunity in secret. Whereas the Nazis had to pay for their crimes against humanity, the Japanese scientists who tortured people were largely let off with no consequences. Many members of the unit, after practicing inhuman brutality, went on to have successful careers. Morris Berg. Everyone in the war had spies. The Germans, the British, Americans, Russians. Some of the greatest spies in World War II were even famous. Take Morris Mo Berg, for example, once called the brainiest man in baseball. He ended his playing career in 1939 with a batting average of .243. The baseball star had a law degree from Columbia University. He could allegedly speak at least a dozen languages and became a special agent with the American OSS in 1943. His job was to gather intelligence on Nazis trying to build an atomic bomb. The baseball star was even sent to Switzerland in December of 1944 to assassinate German physicist Werner Heisenberg. However, when Morris arrived in Switzerland, he quickly determined the Nazis were nowhere close to finishing the nuclear weapon. He had the chance to shoot Heisenberg, but he didn't. He could have murdered one of the top Nazi scientists, but he walked away without being a killer. Still, his secret agent activity gave the US the confidence they needed to continue with the Manhattan Project and beat the Nazis to the barn. Following the end of World War II, Morris Berg became something of a loner. He went from genius baseball player to daring spy, then to a hermit who could barely hold down a job. He worked a little for the CIA in the 1950s, but that was it. He spent the rest of his years with his friends and family. The Pope and the Holocaust. In World War II, while the Germans were busy keeping the truth of the Holocaust a tight secret, there was one person who knew more than most. Recently unsealed Vatican documents show evidence that Pope Pius XII had explicit knowledge of what the Germans were doing to the Jewish people. The Catholic Church's actions during the war have long been under close scrutiny, and nobody's entirely sure what happened. However, it does appear that Pope Pius XII remained silent about the Holocaust, which helped Germany facilitate the deaths of millions of Jews. We already know the Vatican refused to publicly condemn Nazis during the war. This isn't speculation, it's a fact. In 1999, British journalist John Cornwell claimed the Pope believed the Vatican was superior to the plight of the Jewish people. John said the Pope opted to let the Jews suffer so that he himself would not face the wrath of Hitler. To put it as simply as possible, Pope Pius XII's master plan was to become a pawn of Hitler. Hitler's Pope, some have said, to protect the Vatican against the rising threat of communism. This has always been speculation, but now we have physical evidence. Historians recently came across newly opened files from the Vatican's secret archives. These papers indicate that Pope Pius knew about the slaughter of Jews in the fall of 1942. Then, when the United States government asked the Vatican what was happening, they refused to confirm any news of Nazi war crimes. In other words, the Vatican was complicit in the Holocaust. Operation Osoaviakhim. Operation Osoaviakhim came when the war was finished. It began on October 22, 1946. With the fall of Nazi Germany and the death of Imperial Japan, the USSR was eager to begin taking all the best scientists in Europe for themselves. Just like how the American government brought in Nazi scientists to work on their own projects, the Soviet Union did the same. There was a kind of rush by the Americans and the Soviets to grab whichever brilliant German minds they could. For the Soviets, they took thousands of technical specialists from the occupation zone in Germany. They also took a significant amount of military equipment. For example, everything related to the manufacturing of the V-2 rocket was transplanted from Germany to the Soviet Union. Materials were taken from the Luftwaffe Central Military Aviation Center by the Red Army as well. It was like a closing sale in Germany, and everyone wanted the best items for themselves, especially the technology. In just a couple of months, Soviet forces used 92 trains to transport an estimated 15,000 people. These were the military specialists, the most brilliant engineers in Germany and their families. They were taken almost as captives and brought to various locations within the USSR. Many projects these scientists would start working on would carry over to the Cold War era of the following decades. Henschel HS-132. The Henschel HS-132 was supposed to be an extremely powerful jet-propelled dive bomber. It was an ambitious project put together by the Germans in the final years of World War II. It was developed in response to the presence of Ju-87 Stuka dive bombers from the Soviet Union on the battlefield. These old yet still effective bombers plagued the Germans like swarms of locusts. And so, German engineers cooked up the idea for a jet-powered alternative to the piston engine that dated to before the 1930s. It was a revolutionary design that never made it past the prototype stage. By the time the Germans were ready to create what would have been perhaps the most advanced jet fighter in the world, the Soviets destroyed their development facilities. Only a single prototype was completed, and 3 were still under construction when the Soviets got to them first. Like so many advanced weapons and vehicles, the Henschel HS-132 came too late in the war to make a difference. Operation Unthinkable. Operation Unthinkable was a secret plan that thankfully never came to fruition. In 1945, at the end of the war, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill understood that Europe was about to be changed forever. The Allies were on the western side with the communist USSR on the eastern side. Europe was mostly split down the middle, and nobody quite knew which way the ball would go. And so Operation Unthinkable was drawn up to cover all the bases. Winston Churchill and his chiefs of staff drew up 2 different plans to deal with a potential Soviet threat. One plan called for the surprise attack of the Soviets stationed in Germany. The British chiefs of staff put together a plan to ambush the Soviets in a decisive attack to impose the will of the Western Allies. In other words, to stop communism in its tracks and show the Soviets who had the power. However, the planners understood that without help from the Americans, Britain would fail. There was very little chance of success in a direct fight against the Soviets, and for that reason, the British chose not to attack. The second part of Operation Unthinkable was a contingency plan. The British drew up a scenario for what they would do if the Soviets tried to pull off a sneak attack first. These were both highly secret plans that weren't revealed to the public until 1998. Operation Unthinkable was also the true start of the Cold War, the first real contingency plan for all-out war with the Soviet Union. The cryptology of World War II. One of the truly secret sciences of World War II was cryptology. Secret codes were never used in such shocking numbers up until the early 1940s. The Germans and the Japanese developed complex systems to encode and decode sensitive information. The Allies then had to employ their own genius scientists to figure out how to crack both codes, thereby gaining the advantage by obtaining top-secret information. It all began with the German Enigma machine. This piece of genius engineering could turn ordinary text into a secret code. That secret code could then only be deciphered by another Enigma machine. But this wasn't just scrambling letters, it was extraordinarily complicated. The only reason the Allies managed to break the code was because of a German traitor who copied the Enigma machine and shared his knowledge with France and Britain. Then a group of Polish and British mathematicians who operated as part of a secret team codenamed Ultra figured out how to intercept coded messages. The Nazis never found out, but they might have realized their ability to sink ships declined dramatically in 1942. They tried to recover by adding an extra layer of code, but it was already too late. The Americans soon devised their own secret machine called Sigaba, and unlike the German and Japanese code machines that were so effectively cracked, Sigaba remained unbreakable. It was the most secure cryptographic machine of the war, developed by the US Army and Navy before they even started fighting. It continued to be used until 1959, but its patent wasn't declassified until 1996. Nazi experiments. During World War II, the Nazis conducted horrific medical experiments in the name of science. Between 1942 and 1945, the Third Reich carried out brutal scientific tests on prisoners in concentration camps. And although it was in the name of science, very little was ever achieved or learned. One of the major things the Nazis wanted to learn was how to make seawater drinkable. They were trying to figure out what kind of chemicals they could put in seawater to make it healthy for the human body. These tests were carried out from July of 1944 until September of 1944 at the Dachau concentration camp. Subjects were deprived of food and fresh water, and they were only given chemically processed salt water from the ocean. The results of these tests were terrible, and the Nazis never made any scientific progress. There were other horrible experiments as well, such as the high-altitude experiments. Nazis wanted to determine the maximum safe altitude from which a pilot could parachute out of their damaged airplane to safety. In order to do this, the Nazis used living humans as guinea pigs. They also used real people to test drug treatments. They tested immunization compounds and antibodies, as well as the treatments of contagious diseases. This meant they were infecting people with things like malaria and tuberculosis on purpose. They even exposed prisoners to mustard gas, then gave them experimental antidotes to record the effects. And all of this is just the tip of the iceberg. The Tuxedo Park Laboratory. Alfred Lee Loomis was a millionaire scientist who helped win World War II for America by funding scientific research. He didn't just fund the research, he hosted the scientists and the laboratory. He turned his own private estate into a scientific research center. Loomis came from an extremely wealthy family, so he was privileged and had plenty of connections. He studied math at Yale and graduated from Harvard. Then, in 1917, he volunteered for the military. He worked mostly in ballistics at the Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland. It was there that he invented the Aberdeen chronograph, the first instrument that could measure the velocity of artillery shells. Loomis also anticipated the Wall Street crash of 1929. He saved himself by liquidating his assets into gold. He then made a fortune purchasing stocks after they crashed. Loomis became close personal friends with President Roosevelt, who admired his work. He used his money to open a research facility in Tuxedo Park, his own private laboratory. Scientists working at the millionaire's private residence conducted experiments in spectrometry, the measurement of time, and radio detection. It was the team here who helped to build the very first microwave radar, which was loaded into the back of a van and driven around a golf course to track cars and trucks. Seems like a fun friend to have. The Goliath tracked mine. In 1940, the Germans stumbled upon a miniature vehicle prototype in France. The mysterious machine ran on tracks, and it could be controlled remotely. This gave Nazi scientists an idea. and automaker Karl F.W. Borgward was soon ordered to develop a similar vehicle. The Nazis wanted something that could deliver a massive payload of explosives by remote control. It took a few years, but in the spring of 1942, Borgward came out with the Goliath. The Goliath was a remote-controlled mine. It could only travel less than a mile, but it was an impressive piece of engineering. It relied on a 2.5 kilowatt electric motor and could carry about 100 pounds of explosives. However, it was deemed ineffective, and it was ultimately discontinued. But that didn't stop the automaker. Later that same year, a new version came out that used a gasoline engine and had a range of 7 miles. 2 years after that, the Goliath could carry 220 pounds of bombs and was controlled by a 2,000-foot strand of cable connected to a controller box. Over 7,500 of them were built during the war. The Goliath was most notably used during the 1944 Warsaw Uprising to remotely blow up nonconformists. However, it proved a huge waste of time because the Polish Home Army could simply cut the control cords and render the Goliath powerless. The Nazi UFOs. A photograph of a mysterious object hovering above an airport in Prague was taken during World War II. The image was allegedly taken by Joseph Epp, but nobody's sure if it's real. Joseph was an inventor hired by the Nazis to engineer a flying saucer. What many people don't realize is that instead of working on an atomic bomb that could win them the war, Hitler's best scientists were trying to figure out how to create a UFO. The Third Reich put considerable energy into the development of an aircraft that could fly in every direction. In the eyes of the German military, this made a lot of sense. If they could develop a flying saucer with the ability to move through the air in any direction, they would have domination of the skies. Moving up and down meant there would be no more need for runways, and pilots would never be captured by enemy aircraft. They believed a flying saucer would be the apex predator in European skies. This isn't a conspiracy theory, it's something the Nazis really tried to do. Joseph Epp completed his first blueprint for a working flying disc in 1938. The reason it was shaped like a disc was because Joseph thought it would be more stable and easier to maneuver. Models were built as a proof of concept in 1941, and soon after a facility was opened in Prague to build the machines. But the prototypes that were built over the next few years were utter failures. They could never get the flying saucer to move the way they wanted. Then, when Soviet troops took the airport back in April of 1945, Nazi engineers destroyed all records of the progress they'd made and got rid of all the prototypes as well. It's shout-out time! I want to say a big thank you to Stefan Muhammad 45 and Deadfox 89 for supporting this channel. Be sure to subscribe if you haven't already for more videos like these. Gas helmets for babies. There was a lot of weird tech floating around during World War II, but one of the most disturbing inventions was the baby gas helmets designed by the Royal Air Force. There was nothing malicious behind the intent of the helmets, they were just extremely unusual. The idea behind the helmet was to protect babies in the case of a poison gas attack. The British were under constant bombardments during the war, and they were well aware of the Germans' capability of using chemical weapons. Poison gas was common in World War I, and the British were terrified that the Nazis would dust their country in mustard gas. To prepare for a potential catastrophe, the RAF invested money in protecting their citizens. At the beginning of the war, almost every adult in England had their own gas mask. Within a month, the government had designed and distributed respirators for babies and children as well. The adult gas masks were standard, but the ones for babies were a lot more complex. Babies don't have the lung capabilities of using a standard respirator. This is why the baby helmet was developed, a device that fully encapsulated the child, basically locking them inside a gas mask. Once inside, the child received a clean air supply through a manual pump that someone else had to operate. There was also a harness to keep the child from wriggling out of their giant gas helmet, but in reality, it was more like a small cage than a gas mask. Hitler's anti-gravity machine. While Americans were busy building radar devices, Hitler was allegedly crafting his very own anti-gravity machine. It was called Die Glock, and it was one of the wonder weapons that the German dictator hoped to build during World War II. Keep in mind, there is no legitimate proof that Hitler ever had a secret anti-gravity device. But regardless, people have been talking about it for decades. There is no denying that even though the Nazis lost the war, they often had better technology. Arguably, their weapons and machinery were superior. They even developed the very first cruise and ballistic missiles. After the war, conspiracies began to spread about the mythical weapons the Germans had designed but never had time to finish. Die Glock first appeared in the Nazi sci-fi book called Morning of the Magicians that was published in 1960. People said the anti-gravity machine was partially built but never completed. It was allegedly traded to the United States military in exchange for SS Colonel Hans Kammler's freedom. But what the Americans did with it is anybody's guess. The women who won the war. When the men were gone fighting on the front lines, the women were left at home. But that doesn't mean they were idle. In fact, it was a group of women who saved the world during the war and brought home victory for the United States. These women didn't pick up any guns, but they did make serious advancements in computer science that greatly contributed to the war effort. These women were part of a project called ENIAC, or Electronic Numerical Integrator and Computer. This device was the first fully electronic digital computer, created as a secret project in 1945 to calculate artillery trajectories. It was the first device that could track the path of bombs, which was extremely important in the war. Although the machine was invented by two men, John Mauchly and J. Presper Eckert from the University of Pennsylvania, it was a group of female programmers who made it work. The computer was huge, measuring 8 feet tall and 80 feet wide. It contained 18,000 vacuum tubes and 70,000 resistors. It even had 5 million hand-soldered joints. The computer was a big success for its time. It was 1,000 times faster than other machines and could even outperform the human brain. The machine was operated by a group of 6 women who controlled the electronic circuits, switches, and digital trays. These women were Kay McNulty, Betty Jennings, Betty Snyder, Marilyn Meltzer, Fran Bilas, and Ruth Lichterman. The German atomic bomb. If the German military truly had superior weapons and better technology, why weren't they the first to develop the atomic bomb? It's a good question, and one with a fairly simple answer. The shocking truth is that the Nazis never really thought of it. They were busy developing missiles, but nobody ever stopped to think about the usefulness of an atomic bomb. They definitely wanted to win the war, and they spent lots of resources on rockets, planes, and other strange military inventions. But they didn't start a nuclear program until 1939, after they'd already invaded Poland. Germany began their own uranium development project. Physicist Kurt Deibner was tasked with learning what military applications the fission process had to offer. By 1940, brilliant physicist Werner Heisenberg came to the conclusion that nuclear fission could be controlled inside of a reactor. He found out that it could also be used to create an unimaginable explosion, one bigger than anything anyone had ever seen. But like I mentioned, the Nazis weren't fully invested. There was a team working on it, but they weren't nearly as dedicated as the Americans. By 1941, the Nazis were winning the war, and they developed a method for transmuting plutonium. Up until 1942, the Germans were on a real winning streak. The Americans were busy fighting the Japanese, and the English were stuck in Britain. So the Nazis mostly had the Russians to worry about. German scientists just didn't put the effort in that they needed to create an atomic bomb in time. They could have, but Hitler just wasn't worried about it. And by the end, it was simply too late. Australia's Pearl Harbor. One of the worst attacks in World War II occurred on February 19, 1942. The Japanese attacked the small Northern Territory's capital town of Darwin, an event referred to as Australia's Pearl Harbor. The attack was unexpected and unprovoked, and it was extremely devastating. It was the largest attack on Australia by a foreign power. A total of 242 Japanese planes bombed the town of Darwin and the ships in its harbor. The Japanese also bombed the nearby airfields. They thought that if they could destroy the airfields, the Australians couldn't use them to interfere with the Japanese invasion of Timor and Java. The attack caused chaos and panic, and Australia was convinced the Japanese were on their way to invade. This happened only days after the fall of Singapore, when the biggest surrender in British history occurred. In the end, 237 people were killed, and almost the entire town was abandoned. The Australian army had a difficult time controlling their own troops because mass looting broke out after the bombs fell. The troops stationed at Darwin were stealing clothes and refrigerators from houses that had been blown to bits. Thanks for watching! What other things would you like us to do a video about? Let us know in the comments below, and be sure to hit that subscribe button if you haven't already. See you next time! Bye!